My name is Zdybel. I used to work at Atari. That was my claim to fame. I've actually done a lot of other stuff. Did 2,600 carts. Came to the company because they were going to give me an 800 computer. I was all ready to build my own homebrew, but that sold me for sure if the job of making games wasn't good enough. So yeah, I worked for them for 15 years. Through all kinds of Atari. If you have any questions about any phases of Atari, I can basically answer them. I was there the whole time. From 79 to 92, or was it 95? Yeah, 95. 79 to 95, so I was there quite a while.
And I'm Ed Rotberg. I was in the coin-op group, unlike Rob, who was working on in the consumer division. And I was there for a grand total of 8 years over 2 different periods, and did a number of coin-op games, did some stuff for the Atari 800 computer, and then moved on elsewhere in the industry, and that's a long and winding road, so which we can discuss or not discuss today.
Yeah, we both work for 3DO too, so we're happy to dish dirt on that company also. So we don't have a lot of prepared remarks. I mean, I can talk all afternoon, but I kind of prefer to open the floor to questions, let people ask questions about what they're interested in hearing, because I've got stories.
We have stories. If there's particular specific things you want to know about, be happy to divulge what we can remember, which is really the limiting factor here. So better hear about it before that goes away too.
So any questions? Anyone got anything they want to know? No curiosity. Oh wait, there's a gentleman. He's got
okay, so I have stories about Ray Kesar and how, yes.
Ray's my favorite person in the whole world.
I almost kind of, as a fan of Atari, and I love also a lot of coin-op stuff. I love Blastoids. I currently have I-Square out there. I see two sides of the coin where Ray hurt Atari in some ways and helped Atari.
I'd like to know how Ray helped Atari. I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I would have said the same thing.
Well, he claims he helped Atari, help these sort of hippies bring it all into the business.
Oh yeah.
And I kind of disagree with that.
Yeah. Let me tell you my favorite story about Ray Kesar, for those of you who haven't heard this on Howard's video. Actually, I've got a couple of stories on Ray Kesar. But let's talk about the time the Fantastic Four walked out the door and went to form Activision. These were 4 guys that had written most of the code and were basically the established senior programmers when I came on staff in April of 1979. And that was Bob Whitehead, who was an extremely talented individual who didn't talk very much. Al Miller, who was very cold and distant, and you could see he was going to make a perfect corporate CEO someday. Dave Crane, who still has the same attitude. And Larry Kaplan, a very friendly, nice guy who basically brought you into the company and welcomed you in. These 4 guys had been making code for Atari for several years, and they were well aware of how much money they were generating for the company, tens of millions of dollars each. And they went to Ray. Now, I had hired on an Atari, I made, I think, $29,000 or $30,000 a year when I hired in at Atari, which I consider to be a very good wage. This is 1979, and look what I'm doing, right? These guys were being paid like twice as much as me or so, and they went up to Ray and they said, hey, we know how much money you make off our work, and we know we're not getting a fair cut. And Ray Kesar was supposedly a businessman, had been brought in by Warner to run the company after they kicked Nolan out, and he had come from Burlington Northern Textiles. He knew towels. He knew diapers. He didn't know anything about games. And apparently he didn't know anything about business either. Because what he told these guys was not, hey, no problem, I can take care of you. Here's $50,000, $100,000 in chump change. Take it and walk. I love you guys. On the other side about the Fantastic Four that always depresses me is they went to Ray and they said, we don't care how you treat the rest of the engineers, we just want to cut it. So it's kind of gives you an idea of where some of these guys are coming from. And that shows you also how divisive money can be in the business. Anyway, so Ray was not bright, and he told them, you guys are a dime a dozen. You're towel designers. I can replace you in an afternoon. And the fact was he could. There were plenty of young engineers like me, happy to work for peanuts, doing work they love. But he was stupid, because the company was their books of Atari were completely hidden inside of Warner. Warner completely owned Atari. We were a wholly owned subsidiary. No one had any idea in 1979 that Atari was raking in $100 million or $200 million a year or more. No one. And so these guys simply walked out the door and shouted into the venture capital airs above Silicon Valley, "We know where you can get $250,000 a year." And bang, they were funded like that. Now, if that's business acumen, I'd like to know where it was.
Yeah, certainly Ray was more of a factor in the consumer side of the business than he was in the coin-op, but he did manage to get involved with that as well. You hear a lot about the Atari culture, what things were like developing games in that atmosphere, and I was in the video games business from I started January 1st, or 3rd, 1979, and I stayed basically in the video game business until I retired a few years ago. Never have I ever worked with a group of more creative and inspiring people than I did in the coin-op group at Atari. Had friends in the consumer group like Rob. We hung out. It's just, there was an energy and a synergy, and a lot of that changed and started to go downhill when Ray Kassar started managing the company. The company grew much more quickly than people could figure out what they were really supposed to be doing. There was almost a fostered division between the coin-op. At times, with the coin-op group and the arcade division, we traded engineers for a while. They'd go back and forth. There was a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and helping each other, and that there grew to be a wall that became more and more between the two divisions, and it started, honestly, in the marketing group. You'd go to the managers' meetings, and by the time I left Atari, I was quota manager. And the whole meeting was showing the latest commercials for the Atari VCS system, or the Atari 800, or the latest video game that the consumer group came up with. In coin-op, we responded by creating our own video and showing it one of the meetings once. And if I do this next year, I'll bring that video. It's actually kind of funny. No production value in this video at all, but it was a lot of fun to put together, and we kind of stuck it back to the guys. And with all this infrastructure that he was creating, every little part, I'll give you an example of what typified what used to be a wonderful environment slowly turning into something else. We all worked at the same building at 1272 for a while, Borregas in Sunnyvale. And one day we came in, the parking lot was right out in front where the employees would park. And the prime spot, we come in and it was, reserved for facilities. Well, facilities would come over to the building, maybe to clean up in the evening or once in a while, but they did not work in that building. And they wanted the prime spot reserved for themselves. This was like ridiculous, and we all took umbrage at it, and we routinely go out there with black spray paint and paint over the signs that reserved, and come back 2 weeks later, and there it was again, and we'd go out, and because most of us were working vampire hours, we'd come in at noon, and we'd leave at like 2 in the morning, that kind of thing. So there was no one around when we went out to spray paint the parking lot. No one could point any fingers, and their sign would always disappear.
I always learn something new with these things, and I learned now that I only was at Atari 3 months when Ed was only at Atari 3 months when I hired on. I always thought he was an old timer. I don't know why. But
just because I was actually old. I was 27 years old when I started at Atari.
That's a little older than I was.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about the divisions between the teams again. And I
Yeah.
want to go back to a meeting you may remember at the Doubletree Inn in Monterey, where I was like one of my first big corporate meetings, big, you got a hotel room, you got free food, they put you in a big horseshoe table, there's been 300 people in the room, all the execs, coin-op, engineering, all together. And the vice presidents are like, well, we think the time has come to split this company into different divisions. We're going to have a coin-op division, we're going to have a computer division, and we're going to have a 2600 division. And now, me being the young engineer with about 1 year's experience, I stand up on my hind legs and I go, this seems like a really bad idea to me. You know, you may remember that meeting.
Yes,
And I
sir.
said, we have 3 teams right now that are like this. There's incredible synergy between these teams. Guys from CoinOp come upstairs, they play our games, they tell us what's good, what's bad, what they like. We go downstairs, we play their games, we influence their work. Everyone is influencing everyone's work. We have this incredible brew, and you don't want to break that up. And they looked at me like I was from Mars, okay? Because I did not understand where they were coming from. I was an engineer, I hadn't been around management enough to know the important thing is to have your own division and your own building. It doesn't matter if it's productive for the company. I'm vice president. So they created CoinOp division, computer division, HCD, you know, we called them mean names, horrible computer designers, hardly computer designers. Basically HCD got, the people in CoinOp were like a team. I don't think they, but upstairs we split, deliberately bifurcated. And it was like, are you among the cool kids? Or are you going to HCD? Which one is it? And that's why you could kind of see, there was a real difference in quality between the output of the 2 departments. 2600 was putting out certain kind of games, and the 800 department was putting out other kind of games. And most of the good stuff that came out for the 800 in that era actually was outside work.
Yeah, and in fact, or even, you know, the Othello game was written by Ed Logg, who I don't know if you guys know who Ed Logg is.
2600?
Yeah. How many of you owned an Atari computer at one point or another? All right, then you may have heard of the demo program that went out, the in-store demo program, and or the Rotberg synthesizer.
We called that Disco Dirge.
Yeah, well, they played a few other tunes besides that. This was stuff that I wrote on the Atari 800 when we got early copies of the computer to maybe work into our, you know, use as tools. And then, you know, those of us who were aficionados would just sit down and create stuff with it. And when the sales team decided to go to Britain and France to introduce the Atari 800 computer, they asked me out of the CoinOp group to come along as the technical rep, make sure everything was working, talk about tech stuff to the programmers and whatnot that would show up at these unveilings and things. And that was like, that created a stir. You know, the HCD guys were kind of all pissed off. Why are you taking someone from, he doesn't work on that computer? And I was like, hey, it's a free trip to Europe. I'm not going to fight this. So there grew to be, you know, a rivalry and some animosity, which was unfortunate.
Yeah, they took a working system and smashed it into pieces because it suited their career goals more than a functioning company. Who's also got, we talked about management a little bit. Any other questions? We could talk about management all day.
Yeah. Yeah, engineers will always tell you that, you know, the reason that their project failed was management.
You usually have a good cause.
There's a certain amount of truth to that, but, you know, it's not always as simple as that.
So is there a particular area you guys are in? Because Ed and I span the globe. We started in Atari in 1979, and the last team we were together on was a little company called Innovative Leisure, writing software for the iPad 3 or 4 years ago. Okay, so, you know, pretty much anything in the era, we got it. What do you want to know
Talk
about?
about bitter memories. I had a completed game for Innovative Leisure that Rob was extremely helpful on.
It's a beautiful game.
Just never got published. It killed
Is
me.
this a publisher?
Part of why I got on the
Please, do.
Actually, since you guys mentioned unpublished games, so just a little background, Warren Davis was giving his talk on Cuber, and you know, when I was at Disney working there, he used to work there too, and he gave this disc for the second Cuber that was never released. You know, and I brought into the main team, the multi-game machinery team, and you know, threw it out to the public. But so that spawned a whole thing of prototypes. Was there anything back as far as you guys can?
There was tons of software. And in the early days of 2600, pretty much anything you would code up, they would publish. So, Codebreaker. Anyone here remember 2600 Codebreaker? Yeah. You know why Codebreaker got written? It got written because Brad Stewart, the programmer doing it, wanted to get his ham license. And he needed a tool that he could test his tapping with. Yeah, that's why Codebreaker was built. Okay, so that was published. But as things went on, marketing became more and more concerned about quality, and I guess Codebreaker was not top quality. And so more and more stuff, there was more testing and more control over what went out the door. There was a game called Wizards that was put together by Chris Crawford, who some of you might have heard of. Chris went on to design a couple of games that made, some name. He was not a bad designer. But he was not a 2600 guy, and he didn't really get 2600 playing. So he made this game called Wizards, and it was one of the first 2600 games I saw that was like, no, we're not selling this one. In addition to that, there was tons and tons of software, like that was kind of referred to, coming out of the team. Just people sitting down at home and hacking out software. Personally, I would knock off regular company work about Thanksgiving or so. And I would sit down and program a game for my friends every year on the Atari 800. Some of those games are lost forever. Many of them went out as Atari Program Exchange. After Larry Kaplan left the company, I found in his effects an adventure editor that allowed you to build adventures with relative ease. And consequently, many, many adventures were built upstairs and downstairs too.
Dennis Cole's Chinese Puzzle Adventure was one of those.
Yes, the
That
maze
was
of
great.
twisty, windy passages. The other one that was very good, and my personal favorite, was Rob Phillips' Marketing Adventure. Rob Phillip got the adventure tool, and he sat down and wrote this wonderful adventure where you went around and you found the golden disc, and you had to find the buzzword. And the final thing you needed was a tie, or you couldn't get into the marketing meeting. And so you went around there were two buildings in this adventure. One was our building 1272, and the other was 1269 across the street where all the execs hang out. So you went around 1272 and you got your stick, and you went over to 1269 to the marketing meeting, and you got your golden disc, and you got your buzzword, and you got your tie on, but it doesn't work. The game doesn't end, you don't win. And so you walk out the street and you start wandering around, and after a while the light goes on. You can't win marketing adventure.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. In terms of coin-up games that were started, in the early days when I first started there were a lot of games that got killed fairly early on. We had a president of coin-up named Gene Lipkin back then, and if he came through and didn't like the game, he would just kill it. He'd just say, all right, let's not waste the money here, let's start a new game. And to be honest with you, that was very savvy. Eventually, engineering got wise to this, and we created something called the Lipkin switch, which, because he would make these surprise visits and just come through. So he'd come through, Gene Lipkin, and you'd hit the switch with your knee, and all of a sudden the screen would blitz out, and you'd go, we were working on custom hardware. We didn't have a set console we were working on. So, there's something wrong with the hardware. You're going to have to come back later, And that's one of the, working on custom hardware every time is clearly the biggest distinguishing factor in what we did and what these guys did. Their base of knowledge grew every game. Their games built on what they had learned in the previous game. Their techniques, their ability to get more things to happen, to really just twist and squeeze everything out of that VCS. It's legendary what happened with that. In coin-up, you start a new game and you had to learn an entire new set of hardware every time. The only consistency up until that changed was the 6502 processor was the same. So thank goodness for that. So it was a very much a different kind of thing. You worked with a hardware engineer, and if you could cajole them, enough, you might be able to get some special feature in the hardware, which would save you a lot of space in the code, because we were still trying to keep the programs as small as possible. Battlezone was like 4K of code. Everything was in assembly language back then. Are any of you programmers, if I talk about that, are you going to be lost? So there's enough of you, yeah. And then with the 800, one of the cool things that came out for the Atari 800 is someone wrote basically a fourth system. I don't know if you know about the language fourth. It's a very funky stack-based language. You would push something on the stack, and then add them or multiply them. Swap the stack or rotate the three top elements. And basically that's how you did everything. You want to go to a subroutine, you push the address, the next instruction address on the stack, and then you jump to the subroutine. Very primitive language, but you could do a lot of things with that.
Forth
We-
was, Forth was the first extensible language I ever saw.
Right.
I'd never imagined an extensible language before. And that was actually its greatest weakness. So that doesn't look like anyone here has ever heard of Forth. It was a wonderful tool. And that was its greatest weakness. It was totally extensible. So when you sat down and wrote Forth, you ended up extending the language with your subroutines. And that was fatal, because no one else could use your shit.
Exactly. There was no way to like borrow someone else's code and build on that. You really had to start from scratch every time. We did have, when we started using a custom built, it wasn't really an emulator, we called it the Blue Box. But it let us download, manage the code, and disassemble it in real time and look at it. And using Forth, because it was all written in Forth, I wrote basically a decompiler for the vector generator, so we could finally look through our vector generator code and maybe see where the instruction went bad, that do something way off the screen and cause everything to light up that wasn't supposed to light up. But everything was much more custom down in the coin-op group than it was, which, as I said, it had its advantages and had its disadvantages.
Yeah, there's two sides to every story here. He makes it sound like we had a good time or something. I don't know what he's talking about. We were green with envy. I mean, here we are running this piece of hardware that's 4 to 6 years old with 128 lousy bytes of RAM. And these jokers downstairs, they've got vector generators, they've got 3D math, they've got floating point. We can't even do a multiply. Yeah, and so he's right. The result of that was a refining and a torturous squeezing of improvement out of the code over time. And that kind of reminds me of another weird fact about 2600 programming. 2600 cards were supposed to fit in 2K, 4K, absolutely, okay if we got it. In fact, Dave Crane, I said that anything worth doing could be done in 2K. I want you guys to remember that. Next time you look at a GIF that's how many megs, yeah, remember that. Anyway, the weird thing about it was you write a piece of code and you wouldn't worry about the bulk of the code. You'd write the game to get it right. And then you'd look at it and go, well, I've got 5K of code here, no way. And so you do a process we call squeezing code, where you go through your subroutines. I think Todd talked about this a little bit in his lecture today. And you go through and you say, hey, I see where I can save an instruction. Oh, by combining these, I can save a byte. Oh, this loop is a little longer than it needs to be. I can move these instructions around and save 4 bytes. This table doesn't need to be 10 bytes long. 8 bytes will do. I just have to remember not to shoot off the end. All that kind of stuff. You could generally, the odd thing was, always save 10% every time you did a squeeze. Now this was weird because you would squeeze repeatedly. You'd come in and do a 3-day squeeze and you'd knock your 5K code down to 4.5, right? And then you'd come in the next day, you'd hit it again, you'd knock it down, take another 3-day squeeze and you knock it down to almost 4K. And then the third run, boom, it fit 4K now. Just the oddest thing, you could almost always get 10% reduction in the size of your code, no matter how many times you've done it already. Very peculiar.
But by the same token, you knew the limits of the system you were working on when you designed your project. And often we didn't. And as a result, I think many of the coin-op games that came out that were very cool, if we had reused the hardware for something else, and we started to later, we could have gotten more out of that hardware system. But things were changing so fast that it became a race. How do we stay, the home games were getting good. We were, not to disparage the VCS, but we were getting the next generation of consoles coming out. How do we keep people going to the arcade instead of, just staying at home and playing with their console games? It was a very interesting dynamic back then, and it affected the way we went about the coin-op business and how the coin-op business evolved over time as well.
We didn't actually see ourselves as rivals, at least I didn't. But it was like 2 totally different ways of approaching the consumer market. When you wrote a VCS game, the object was to give the player $30 worth of game, right? And let them have $30 worth of fun or more, whatever they paid for the damn card. But with coin-op, the thrust of the game was to keep the player actively interested and hungry and throwing quarters into the pot.
Yeah, it's the difference between bringing your checkbook to the store to buy something that's going to be fun and something that only takes a quarter, and better be fun enough in the time you spend that quarter that you'll be interested in spending another quarter. If you don't grab them early in a coin-op game, you are not going to grab the player. And I think once you lay down your $30 or whatever it cost per cartridge back then, you had an investment in the game to begin with. You were going to take the time to figure it out, and you could do much deeper games. All of this evolved over time, but certainly, in the late 70s and early 80s, that was the difference in the dynamic in developing games for the two platforms. It had to be really quick to be fun, really hard to be great. In the consumer group, it didn't have to be quite as quick to be fun, and had to give you a lot of legs.
Yeah, but for totally different design environments and completely different design decisions. It's actually kind of interesting. But then we were the totally twins. I mean, Neubauer's Star Raiders, I'm sure some people have seen Doug's brilliant piece of work. That thing is a result of about 50 engineers walking through the lab going, this is kind of fun, but you know what would be nice?
Yeah, I keep getting stuck over here, and that feels wrong,
It was beautiful. We went down to Coin-Op, they came up to us, and it was the best collaborative environment I have ever worked on. Yes, in the back.
Rob, I got a question. Did you ever see anything come in from any APX submissions that you guys learned from? Because these are all amateurs out there supposedly, but.
No, we didn't. I remember, in fact, looking at several APX submissions, which were actually related to Reese's titles, and I disparaged them greatly. And I'm kind of sorry now, because one was Boulder Dash, and was a very popular game. It wasn't bad done, but I looked at it, oh, you could do that in an afternoon. And the other was Caverns of Mars, which was also very popular, and another game that management brought me to look in, and I said, all right. So this is me. I'm very much a family guy. When you're on my team, you're on my family, and we're a brotherhood. But when you're outsider, I'm much more critical.
Right, because very few of those got turned into genuine Atari programs.
And none of them came into the shop with anyone going, wow, we can really learn something from this, because you could tell at a glance there was nothing to learn. Yeah.
Why do you think the Atari ST never gained market traction?
That's a good question. It was a nice vanilla machine. It didn't really have anything going for it in a lot of ways. I mean, I liked programming the ST because it was nice and vanilla. Had a nice bitmap and a straight up processor and a nice, it didn't have a lot of
16-bit.
ASICs or anything you had to work with, and it had multiply. So I did a couple of projects for that platform, and I enjoyed working with it. But it was never really intended as a game machine. It was intended as like kind of a Commodore workaday computer, and I think that niche was going away.
And the Atari name was really never synonymous with computing.
Games.
It was games. And people who bought Atari, and in many ways that's a shame, because the Atari 800 was really an awesome little computer. As just a computing machine, it was an awesome little computer. There was such a bigger base of consumers and creators for the Apple that it really had no chance. It's why we ended up with a VHS instead of Beta.
I don't really think the Apple was much of a competition for the 800. My personal feeling is the reason the Atari 800
Commodore.
did not sweep the marketplace was strictly our management. They looked at the Atari 800 and they told us they wanted a business machine. That's what they really wanted. Now they had a company, Atari, which had name recognition #1 next to Coca-Cola, except our name was identified with games, not beverages. And they decided they wanted to go into the business world. That was pure madness as far as I can tell. And that largely because they hid the 800's light under a bushel basket is why. That machine, the 400, was intended to go into the home in 1979. That's why I had the crappy little keyboard. It was going to be your 2600. And the people who wanted more were going to get the 800 and had a keyboard. But they hated the 400 because it made the 800 look like what it was, a little game machine. So they really hated the 400, and they basically buried the 800. They tried to sell it as a business product, and no one wanted it. Ironically enough, when IBM came out with the IBM PC, We brought one into the lab and we laughed our heads off at that piece of junk. In fact, we had an oven, we had all sorts of stuff in the lab, which we usually put things in to heat them up to see it. That thing failed at like 120 degrees, you know? Actually, the original 800, by the way, we said that the grid on the top of the 800 to let the heat out there, yeah, we said that was for frying burgers. But it was, they hated that machine. They did not want to come up with another game machine. It wasn't until we went to the show and Nintendo had their secret booth that we had to sneak into to see their new machine that they started to realize, uh-oh, there's something called new hardware. Remember, this is the first time out. You can't blame them for everything, except the fact they were schmucks.
Question. When they came out with 5200, it's essentially the Atari 400 computer.
Correct.
But they took all the good stuff and they put in those crappy controllers, and they changed the format of the cartridge,
Yep.
which they eventually came out with the XE game system, which was essentially the same thing that could have been successful. What were the programmers, what was management and programmers talking about?
5200 is a fun project. It's one of my favorites. Let's see, my favorite story about 5200 project is Jerry Jessup, one of the engineering technicians. When we shipped the 5200, Jerry put up a big sign, and I mean a big sign, a 6x4 cardboard sign in his office that stuck up above the side of his cube, and it said in giant letters, "Yes, I have a 5200 at home, but I consider myself intelligent enough not to take it out of the box." Nintendo scared the hell out of them, okay? And for some reason, they convinced themselves they couldn't sell the 800, so they had to repackage it, all right? And we hated it. The controller was terrible. In fact, the vice president of engineering at the time, a certain Dave Remsen, I don't think I'm going to do him any harm by telling the fact that he was actually fired from that position because his credentials had been completely falsified. Now, most of the engineers had figured out that something was wrong because Dave didn't know the difference between a sine and a cosine. So, and he kept telling us everything was fine. Now, that hardware all came from the hardware side of the house. I was software, all right? And this is where I learned the meaning of cognitive dissonance. Because I would go to upper management meetings and I would tell them, this is crap, the controllers don't work, the game machine is not functional, we can't do this product. This is a terrible environment, we need a better environment. And then I would have to go talk to the programmers because I was one of the top programming managers. And they would say, this platform stinks, the controllers are awful. And I would have to say, no, it's not that bad. It torques your mind to do that stuff. It was a terrible machine, it was a terrible decision, and it was basically because they had failed to sell the Atari 400 years before. One of the other interesting things about that, which I was responsible for, was the fact that when we designed the 1500, we made sure that it was not backwards compatible with the 2600. We cut it in such a way that it couldn't be made easily backwards compatible with the 2600, because we felt, and I still feel, that if you have a machine that, like a 2600, and you have a bunch of carts for it, and I come out with a new machine, are you really going to want to play your crappy old carts on your new machine? I don't know. Maybe there's a demand to play 2600 carts on iPhones. It's out there possibly. I don't know. But I've never felt that was a good goal. Anyway, management changed their mind and decided they absolutely had to support 2600 carts. So one of my good friends, George Howard, ended up building basically, do you ever see the 2600 adapter for a 5200? Yeah. You know why it's so big?
It's basically 2600 in, all it's doing is just passing the video out, but
The only thing that thing does is take VCC in and send the video back out to the video bus. That's all that it does. Because we cut it in such a way that he couldn't do anything else. There's no bus out there. He couldn't see anything to do it usefully. Yeah, and this is kind of miscommunication between marketing and engineering that leads to this kind of madness. But yeah, I was responsible for that. That was my fault.
In the first couple of years of the 800's existence, Atari was, from what I've heard, very insular on providing good documentation on how to produce the software.
It was a secret.
Similar to stuff in the past. And then,
Well, they looked at like the 2600, then anything in the box inside the ASIC was a secret.
so everyone, obviously that hurts development of applications to actually use the hardware well. And I don't know if it was Commodore coming out 2 or 3 years later that really.
Actually,
Doors open, actually do one.
The person who threw the doors open on the Atari side, again, was Chris Crawford, and I wish we had tapes of this. I bet I can find them somewhere. Where Chris is actually dressed as a chip, and he's throwing foam letters and stuff around and talking about how the Antic chip works and stuff. It's amazing. It's one of the more amazing things you'll ever see. Yeah, and so we about 81 or so, and HDD came around. HDD said, we really need to open the doors. There's no reason. There's nothing here secret. Or should be. You paid for the box. That was a nice machine. I love programming the Atari 800. That's what I signed on, was to program the 800. I was disappointed when they made me write 2600 code. That was a great machine.
The 7800, so was that another management decision to have the 2600 backward compatibility?
7800 was even more screwed up. 7800 was done completely out of house by a company called, was it GCC, I want to say? Yeah, thank you. I'm really bad with names, so watch me. And it turned out that Ray Kazar owned a large percentage in that company, and that's why they were being given so many contracts. Or at least that's what I heard later. As on the inside of the house, GCC got their start in a lawsuit with Coin-Op, as I recall.
Yeah.
Missile command.
For Missile Command, that's right. And they were good programmers, there was no doubt. But they had an outsized influence on our management, and I always wondered why, and that's why I always believed that story when I heard it later. And they came to the shop one day and they said, we've souped up the 2600. And you're like, 5200 was a bad idea, what is this? And that was actually about the time the Trammels took the company over. And I think they shipped that product, but I was not involved with it anymore after that. I was on ST and Jaguar, and they wanted me on the cutting edge.
Sat on warehouse shelves for 2.5 years before Trammels decided. Meanwhile, Nintendo and Sega.
What was it? It's nothing but a 2600 overclocked, basically. It doesn't bring that much to the game.
6502 with a better video chip.
It's
And a
like,
worse sound chip.
and you still got that clunky 20 pixel background, I mean, you haven't really moved ahead. The 400 was the machine, and yet all these screwy 5800, 7800 garbage, all because, they couldn't look that direction.
But again, it could play 2600 games, but that was essentially a separate circuit, like that switch.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on the cartridge that went
Yeah, that also. But by that time, you could fit a Project 600 on a single chip. Yeah, so that was all good.
There's a gentleman, Steve Golson, did a speech on 7800 before. It's on YouTube, so anybody's really interested in that development lifecycle, how that came about. That's a good resource to jump into. It's a whole panel all by itself.
That was, again, it's like, I once read an account by survivors of the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history. And he said, yeah, we got up in the morning, we brewed tea, and we were told to go over to a little village. So we drove over there, and we had lunch, and nothing happened over there. So they sent us over to this other little village, and it was cold, and we went to bed. And that was his experience of the Battle of Kursk. And so being an Atari was kind of like that. You see your own little piece of the picture.
Yeah.
So I didn't see any of that 7800 stuff until one day I walk in the office. We want to push this new machine. What do you think? Really, 2600 still? What year is this? This 7800 would have been a great idea in 1980.
Did either of you leave any Easter eggs?
No. Well, yeah, I mean, after that became kind of a popular thing, it's interesting, before Space Invaders, in the coin-op side of things, before Space Invaders, there was no such thing as a high score table. There was no way for a player to leave his mark on the game. And we put a high score table into Asteroids, I believe was the first game that got that. And I'll tell you a cute story about that, and then I'll get back to your question about Easter eggs. Ed Logg, who programmed Asteroids, was working in the same lab as I, and there was another one of we call them vampires, guys who would work real late. Real character, Owen Rubin, would come in every night and fill up the high score table with ORR, which was his initials. And Ed would get pissed off when he'd come in the morning and he'd see the entire high score table ORR. So he obviously put code in to detect ORR and O space R and all the variations and change them all to his name. So when Owen would come in and play, he'd fill it up with Ed Log's name, and he was fine with that. But when we saw, some of the Easter eggs come out in some of the other games, Warren is the first, apparently Ron Milner did something like that way back when, but I was not aware of it. Warren Robinette's Easter egg in Adventure was the first one I was aware of. And obviously that's from Atari. I left some, I did not have one in Battlezone. That was before, I learned about that and really got conversant with it. But some of the other games I worked on definitely had Easter eggs in them.
It was a little harder to put Easter eggs into 2,600 games. Okay, remember the squeezing thing? Yeah, I mean, there weren't a lot of bytes left around. There are things like, if you look at, I believe, Atari Centipede, if you look at the source code, you'll find Dave Loves B in the source code, because it was too much work to get it on the screen and stuff like that. So the Easter eggs are really hidden sometimes.
Yeah, they let us get away with a little bit more as time passed on.
And then later in your career, it's like, we need an Easter egg for this game. What's it going to be?
One of you mentioned that you played Blasteroids a lot. Do you know about the Easter egg in that one?
No, I was wondering about that actually.
You can't do it on the free play because it requires you to press all the buttons on the left-hand side and spin the right dial, if I remember this right, counterclockwise or clockwise when the credit screen is up. Not much of an Easter egg. It changes from saying, Captain Ed Rotberg to Captain Gabe's dad. We wanted to get our kids' names in there as well at that point, things like that. So I don't even know if my son realizes this. I mean, he was just an infant at that time. So all this reminds me about how Atari went to such great lengths to keep the names of the engineers quiet after the Activision guys left. They did not want anybody knowing. At one point, a writer from Smithsonian Magazine came in to do an article about Atari and the whole arcade game phenomenon. And he interviewed us, he had pictures of us in there, and was not allowed to use any of our names. And it was crazy, we couldn't. So the whole thing about credits in the game, that became a running sore point in our group, certainly, and I know for the BCS guys, probably even worse. So the Easter eggs was a way to let off steam because we couldn't do what we really wanted to do was put our names on there, which eventually they did, they had to.
Which brings us back to Chris Crawford, actually. Chris organized the first video game developers conference. It was in his apartment. And one of his big pushes was, we are not getting the recognition that we need as video game programmers. I guess we're getting it now. And his whole trick was, look, when you go to buy an album, you don't go, what's the latest thing from Warner Records? What's Neil Young got? What are the Osmonds got? You go out looking for the artist that you want to see.
The Osmonds?
Whatever. We've got a wide audience here. So, you're looking for the audience, but that video game business is not run like that. They hide us. People, what's Atari got? What's Commodore got? What's Magic releasing this week? And so it was he had a very compelling argument, and we never got there, really. I mean, what they finally did was, okay, we'll put your names in the game. Shut up. Sit down.
Just real quickly, to add on to that, it was Trip Hawkins who really was the first one to try to push the designers as rock stars.
Our tours.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if this was discussed, we haven't missed it, it's getting late, my apologies, but you were a fan of developing Battlezone for the military, right?
Yeah.
And then there were currently 2 versions of that was made for the military? Or
There were 2 copies made for them. Yeah, two units made.
And one is in some clip for some reason.
Yeah, they're welcome to have it.
You should have heard a bellyache about that at the time, by the way.
I'll be brief about this because we only, we're just about done here, but someone in upper management had been, discussing about how, we could use our systems after Battlezone came out, we could simulate like real stuff and things like that. And he, I don't know, had some connection with some retired Army general, and there was this other group of retired Army generals who heard about this, and they said, well, can you make us a simulator for the infantry fighting vehicle, which is a specific kind of vehicle, the Bradley fighting vehicle. They're basically the same kind of thing, made by FMC, which is Food Manufacturing Corporation. I don't know.
San Jose?
In San Jose. But in any event, they came and said, well, you know, we'll pay you to do this, but yeah, let me just finish it real quick. We have to get it to TRADOC, which is the international training for, you know, for the armed forces, and we want to show it there. Well, that was 3 months away. And so this whole thing, including entire new models, entire new collision detection, dealing with trajectory, because we had to model this stuff, all had to be done in a period of 3 months. I basically, you know, worked probably 15 hours a day, went home, saw my wife, said good night, woke up, left before she woke up, and worked again. For 3 months, I lost my life on that. So I have, yeah, I don't have fond memories of that project.
Thank you all. It's been a lot of fun.